I do not remember hitting the floor. I remember the lock refusing to open. I remember smoke curling thin and gray beneath the door, the emergency lights flickering that particular shade of red that makes a room feel like it's already given up on you. I remember thinking, with the strange clarity panic sometimes hands you right before it takes everything else away, that dying behind my own penthouse door would be an embarrassing way to go, embarrassing even for me. And I have survived worse headlines than most CEOs see in a lifetime. Then I woke up with my billionaire rival crying beside me. Celeste Rowan did not cry. She dismantled companies over lunch and left before dessert. She fired executives without blinking, without raising her voice, without a single muscle in her face admitting the decision cost her anything. She won arguments before the other person had finished realizing an argument had started. For 20 years, I had watched that woman's composure survive things that would have broken anyone else. Lawsuits, hostile takeovers, a decade of tabloids trying to find a single crack in her. But when I opened my eyes in that private hospital suite, her hand was wrapped around mine so tightly it hurt, and her face was wet with tears she wasn't even trying to hide anymore. That was how I learned my enemy had broken down my door before she ever admitted she loved me. Before we go further, if you love slow burn stories about billionaire rivals, ice queens who only crack once someone almost dies, forced neighbors, and 20 years of hidden love disguised as hatred, stay with me because this one earns every second of it. Now let's go back. Back before the locked door. Back before the blackout. Back before Celeste Rowan ever cried beside my hospital bed to the boardroom where this war supposedly began. Part 1. The Boardroom War. 30 shareholders sat frozen around a table built for consensus, and currently hosting none. The Rowanvale merger, said the board chair, with the particular caution of a man standing between two loaded weapons, requires both parties to agree on integration terms by end of quarter. The merger requires Ms. Rowan to acknowledge that her division's numbers wouldn't exist without my supply infrastructure, I said, not looking up from my tablet. The merger requires Ms. Vale, Celeste replied, in the flat, unhurried voice she used exclusively for destroying people politely, to acknowledge that infrastructure without demand is simply an expensive warehouse. Around the table, junior executives exchanged the specific look people share when they're watching two apex predators circle the same reservoir. My assistant, Milo, sitting 2 seats down, discreetly opened his phone and typed something I would later learn was a running note titled Rivalry Incident Log. Do not delete. Perhaps, the board chair tried again, we could discuss the shipping consolidation. There is nothing to consolidate, Celeste said, until Ms. Vale stops routing product through 3 unnecessary distribution hubs to inflate her division's logistics footprint. I don't inflate anything, I said. I optimize for redundancy, which is a concept Ms. Rowan's division has apparently never needed, given how rarely it delivers anything on time. Celeste's expression did not change. It never changed. That was the maddening thing about her. I had spent 2 decades trying to provoke a single visible reaction out of that face, and had collected, at most, the faint tightening of her jaw that meant she'd decided I wasn't worth a verbal response. The meeting ended, as most of our joint meetings did, with nothing resolved and everyone else in the room quietly grateful to leave alive. Everyone called it hatred, because hatred was easier to understand than 20 years of paying attention. Part 2, age 10, science fair. The history, if anyone had bothered to ask either of us honestly, went back considerably further than any merger. I was 10 years old the first time I saw Celeste Rowan, standing very straight beside a science fair volcano that, unlike mine, did not explode prematurely and ruin her dress. She had won first place. I had won a participation ribbon and a stain that never came out of my good shoes. You cried, she told me afterward, with the flat, clinical honesty children have before they learn tact is supposed to soften things. When your volcano didn't work. I did not. You did, I saw you. A pause. I would have helped you fix the baking soda ratio if you'd asked. I did not ask. I spent the next 8 years making sure I never had to ask Celeste Rowan for anything. through debate finals where she dismantled my arguments with surgical calm, through a chess tournament where she took my queen in 11 moves, and then, unaccountably, seemed disappointed rather than triumphant when I resigned rather than play out a loss. "You gave up too early," she said then too. "I wanted to see what you'd do next." I did not understand, at 17, that this was the closest thing to a compliment Celeste Rowan was capable of giving. I only understood competition and score, and the particular ache of being the person who always finished second to the same girl in every room we shared. Celeste never remembered the medal. She remembered Adriana looking at her across the stage. Neither of us, in all those years, ever said the truth out loud. That losing to anyone else would have been unbearable, but losing to her was the only loss that felt like being seen. Part 3. The Penthouse Mistake. 2 decades and 1 merger later, I bought a penthouse to escape my family's insistence that I attend a gala I had no interest in attending, and to put physical distance between myself and a company I was, at the time, actively at war with. The elevator doors opened onto the top floor. Celeste Rowan stood in the hallway outside the neighboring unit, key in hand, wearing the exact expression of someone recalculating a very expensive mistake in real time. "You bought the other penthouse," I said. "I bought this penthouse 11 months ago," Celeste said. "You apparently just bought the one beside it." We stood in that hallway for a long, silent moment, both of us clearly running the same calculation. The sheer improbability, the sheer inconvenience, the sheer audacity of the universe placing us 11 feet apart after 2 decades of trying to stay as far from each other as boardrooms and continents would allow. "I'm not moving," I said. "I already told you I'm not either," Celeste said, and closed her door with the particular finality of a woman ending a negotiation she had no intention of losing. Milo, our shared building's misfortune of an assistant liaison between both our offices, began carrying aspirin in his jacket pocket that same week. He would need it. Part 4. Petty Domestic War. What followed was less a rivalry and more a campaign, conducted with the same precision both of us brought to boardrooms, except now deployed over dinner deliveries and parking spaces. Celeste's food order arrived at my door by mistake one evening, and rather than correct the error, I ate it. She responded, 3 days later, by having 20 identical meals delivered to my apartment at precisely the hour I usually ate dinner, with a note, "Since apparently you cannot be trusted with a single meal." I filed a noise complaint against her for a 6 a.m. call with Tokyo that carried through the shared wall. She filed one back against me for playing music too loudly at 11 p.m., though I strongly suspected, given how promptly her complaint arrived, that she had simply been listening the entire time and waiting for an excuse. The building's smart home system, installed by a contractor who apparently could not tell 2 identical penthouses apart, connected our thermostats without either of our knowledge for nearly a week. I discovered it when my apartment mysteriously warmed itself every night at exactly 10 p.m. The hour, I would later learn, Celeste always felt the cold settle into her hands. She discovered her own heater had been quietly repaired one freezing week when she hadn't reported it broken at all, and never asked who had arranged it, though the timing made the answer obvious to anyone paying attention. We were, by any outside measure, at war. But underneath the war, we had begun taking care of each other in the only language either of us trusted enough to use. Small, deniable, easily dismissed as coincidence. Adriana stole Celeste's dinner, but later sent 20 replacements. Celeste filed a noise complaint, but secretly fixed Adriana's broken heater. Neither of us called any of it what it actually was. Part 5. The Cat on the Balcony. The first real crack in Celeste's armor happened on an ordinary Tuesday, and I only saw it because I happened to be standing on my own balcony at the exact hour I usually wasn't. Celeste knelt on her side of the divide, in clothes far too soft and unstructured for the woman I knew from boardrooms, coaxing a limping stray cat toward a small dish of food with a patience I had genuinely never seen her extend to another human being. She spoke to the animal in a low, careful voice, checking its injured leg with gentle, practiced hands, and stayed there for nearly 40 minutes until the cat finally trusted her enough to eat. I watched from the shadows of my own balcony, unseen, and felt something in my understanding of her quietly rearrange itself. Maybe Celeste was not heartless. Maybe she was just careful about what she let the world touch. The next morning, a coffee arrived at her door, her exact order, prepared exactly the way she took it, though I had never told anyone how she took her coffee and had, in fact, only learned it myself through years of unwilling, resentful observation. I attached no note. When Milo asked whether it had been an accident, I told him it must have been a wrong delivery. He did not believe me. I did not expect him to. Part 6, the war room. The crisis, when it came, arrived the way corporate crises always do. Suddenly, at the worst possible hour, demanding both of us in the same room with no time left for pretense. A shipping route crisis threatened both divisions simultaneously, and Celeste and I found ourselves standing shoulder to shoulder over a digital map at nearly midnight, close enough that, when she reached across to redirect a route, her arm brushed mine, and neither of us moved away fast enough to pretend it hadn't happened. "You haven't eaten," she said, without looking up from the map. "Neither have you." I asked first. "You didn't ask. You observed and then reported it like a metric." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but its distant relative. "You look exhausted, Adriana." It was the first time in 20 years she had used my first name instead of my surname, and I felt it land somewhere I had spent 2 decades keeping carefully guarded. Milo interrupted before either of us could examine what had just happened, bursting in with a fresh set of shipping data and the particular relief of a man who had, without knowing it, just prevented a conversation neither of us was prepared to finish. They were supposed to be discussing shipping routes. Neither of them remembered the map. Part 7, the blackout. The blackout hit the entire district at 11:47 p.m., 3 days after the war room. On a night I happened to be alone in my penthouse, reviewing contracts. I no longer had the concentration to actually read. The lights failed first. Then the backup generator, apparently victim to the same grid failure, failed to engage. Then the smart lock on my front door, the same system that had connected our thermostats without permission, glitched into a locked state it refused to release, no matter how many times I entered the code. Smoke began seeping from an electrical fault somewhere in the building's compromised wiring, thin at first, then thicker, curling under the door in gray ribbons that made the dark apartment feel smaller with every passing minute. I called security. The call dropped. I called again. Nothing. My hands were shaking too hard to manage the keypad a 4th time, and the smoke had begun to make my throat feel tight and wrong. I don't remember deciding to bang on the shared wall. I only remember doing it, my palm flat against the plaster, calling a name I had spent 20 years refusing to call out for help. "Celeste." My vision narrowed. The floor came up faster than I expected, and then there was nothing at all. Part 8, she did not wait. Celeste would tell me, much later, what happened on the other side of that wall, in pieces, over months, never all at once, because some of it still cost her something to say out loud. She heard the alarm first, the building-wide emergency signal, followed almost immediately by the specific, muffled sound of a fist against shared plaster, and a voice she had never once heard sound afraid. She smelled the smoke before security even confirmed there was a fire. She saw the emergency lighting flicker red beneath my door. And when she called my name and received only silence, something in her stopped operating by any rational calculation at all. Security told her to wait for the fire team. She did not wait. She ran barefoot down the hallway in the clothes she'd fallen asleep in, and when the door held against her weight, she did not call a locksmith and she did not call the front desk again. She found the emergency axe mounted in the hallway fire case, the one neither of us had ever imagined either of us would need, and she broke the lock herself, splintering the frame, until the door gave way and she found me collapsed just inside it. Celeste Rowan did not wait for permission. Adriana was behind that door. That was the only authorization she needed. Part 9, waking up. I woke in a private medical suite, the smell of smoke replaced by antiseptic, an oxygen line taped gently beneath my nose, and a hand wrapped around mine hard enough that I felt it before I fully opened my eyes. Celeste Rowan did not cry. She bankrupted companies without a flicker of guilt. She fired executives without blinking. She won every argument before the other person realized one had started. But when I opened my eyes, her hand was wrapped around mine, and her face was wet with tears she had entirely stopped trying to hide. "Celeste." "Don't," she said, her voice rough in a way I had never once heard from her, not in 20 years of watching her voice do exactly what she commanded it to do. "Don't ever make me stand on the other side of a locked door from you again." "Why were you crying?" I asked, because some part of me needed to hear her say it, needed the confirmation that this wasn't shock or exhaustion or the ordinary human response to a neighbor's emergency. Celeste looked at me for a long moment, the mask that had protected her for 2 decades entirely absent from her face, for possibly the first time I had ever witnessed. "Because for 1 minute," she said, "I lived in a world where you were gone." Adriana understood, in that hospital bed, with her rival's hand locked around hers. This hate had never once been hate at all. Part 10, the morning after. Mornings have a way of returning people to their armor, and Celeste's returned to hers faster than mine did. By the time I was discharged the following afternoon, the woman who had broken down a door for me the night before had rebuilt every wall she'd let fall, brick by careful brick, before I even reached the lobby. "Last night was an emergency response," she said, in the boardroom voice, the one that ended discussions rather than opened them. "Nothing more. Adrenaline produces atypical behavior. It would be a mistake to read further into it." Something in my chest, which had spent the entire night convinced it had finally found solid ground, dropped through a floor I hadn't known was there. "Right," I said, matching her tone exactly, because I had learned from the very best how to build a wall in under 3 seconds when a wall was the only dignity available to me. "Of course, a temporary stress response." We stood there, both of us hurt, both of us pretending the hurt belonged to the other person and not to ourselves, both of us too well trained in 20 years of pride to be the first to admit the pretending wasn't working. Part 11, forced cohabitation. The fire inspectors condemned my penthouse for repairs the following week: smoke damage, a compromised electrical system, a door that would need to be entirely rebuilt. The timeline for restoration ran to 6 weeks minimum. "You'll stay with me," Celeste said, in the same tone she used to announce merger terms, leaving no space in the sentence for negotiation. "I could stay in a hotel." "You could," she agreed. "You won't." I arrived that evening to find the guest room already prepared. Fresh linens, a stocked bathroom shelf with the exact brand of the specific unscented soap I used, a reading lamp positioned at the angle I preferred for the late hours I usually spent working in bed. "You knew I'd need this," I said to her housekeeper, unable to keep the surprise from my voice. "Miss Rowan prepared it before you woke up at the hospital," the housekeeper said, matter of fact, clearly unaware she was handing me evidence of something Celeste had spent all morning trying to deny. Care, it turned out, was a language Celeste Rowan had been fluent in for longer than either of us had been willing to admit. Part 12, interrupted confessions. Living under the same roof produced, predictably, a string of almost confessions that neither of us managed to finish. In the kitchen one morning, Celeste began, "Adriana, about the hospital," and got exactly that far before her phone rang with an investor demanding an emergency call, and by the time the call ended, the moment had folded itself back into silence. Over breakfast the following day, I tried myself. "Celeste, when you said you lived in a world where I was gone, I need to know if you meant." A courier arrived at the door with contracts requiring an immediate signature, and Celeste, visibly relieved by the interruption in a way that told me everything and nothing at once, excused herself to deal with it. By the fireplace on a rare quiet evening, she got as far as, "There's something I should have told you 20 years ago," before her cleaning robot, malfunctioning on a badly timed sensor error, collided directly into the coffee table between us and sent both our drinks sliding toward the floor. Milo, tracking all of this with the devotion of a man documenting a slow-motion disaster, updated his running note that week. Relationship status. Still idiots. Part 13. The final crisis. The last crisis arrived, as the worst ones always do, at the worst possible hour. A hostile bid threatening to unwind both companies simultaneously, requiring Celeste and me to present a unified front to a room of shareholders who had spent 20 years assuming our rivalry made unity impossible. We worked through the night in her office, the same proximity that had once felt dangerous now simply feeling necessary, until exhaustion finally stripped away whatever composure either of us had left to spend. "I need to tell you something before this goes any further," Celeste said, setting down her tablet with the particular finality of someone who had run out of ways to postpone a sentence. "Tell me." "I did not enter those competitions to beat you," she said. "Not the science fair, not debate, not chess. I entered because your name was already on the list, and some part of me, even at 10 years old, could not stand the idea of a room you were in that I wasn't." I reached into the drawer of the desk I'd been using during my stay, where I had, weeks earlier, quietly relocated an object I had carried through every move of my adult life without ever explaining why, and set it on the table between us. A chipped, broken chess queen piece, the one she had taken from me in 11 moves at 17 years old. "You were not the only one looking across every room," I said. Celeste stared at the piece for a long moment, and then at me, something finally, fully unguarded in her expression. For 20 years, they had called it rivalry because neither of them was brave enough to call it wanting. Part 14. The payoff. The kiss, when it finally came, was not dramatic. It was quiet, and it was slow, and it carried the particular weight of 2 decades of almost, of every insult that had actually been attention, of every competition that had actually been a way of staying close enough to be noticed. "I am still going to argue with you in every boardroom for the rest of my life," Celeste said afterward, her forehead resting against mine, her voice steadier than I had heard it in weeks, and still somehow unlike anything I'd known of her before that door came down. "Good," I said. "I would be suspicious of you if you stopped." Part 15. Circular ending. The boardroom looked exactly as it had the day this story began. 30 shareholders. A merger still contested in the details. The same tension in the air that had defined every meeting we'd ever shared. "The distribution hub allocation is inefficient," Celeste said, exactly the way she always had. "The distribution hub allocation is the reason your division delivers anything on time at all," I said, exactly the way I always had. Milo, no longer carrying aspirin, simply smiled and made a note that had nothing to do with rivalry logs anymore. To everyone at that table, we still looked like enemies who had spent 20 years failing to find any common ground at all. But under the table, where none of the 30 frozen shareholders could see, Celeste's hand held mine like she had never quite forgiven that locked door for keeping us apart, and never intended to let another door do it again.